The German soldiers had made every effort to hide their presence, establishing a defensive position deep within the tree line, as well as ensuring that any tracks left in the surrounding ground had been meticulously covered over. Strict orders were issued that no fires were to be lit, with pickets posted to provide a warning of any sign of the enemy forces undoubtedly pursuing them. But with morale and motivation in such a poor state, it was inevitable that mistakes would be made. The last 4 months had seen their numbers dwindle, with still further casualties being sustained with each failed attempt to encircle the port of Murmansk. And now, with victory seemingly so close, the Finnish forces accompanying them had been withdrawn, leaving the path clear for the Soviet defenders to seek a bloody retribution. Prior to the commencement of Operation Silver Fox, the duties of the 6th SS Division had mainly consisted of routine border patrol and the policing of a largely passive population. But in no time at all, their ranks had been swollen with conscripts from various nations, subjugated by German occupation, before they were then reluctantly pushed up to the front of an advance, deep into Russian territory. The beleaguered survivors of Mountain Division Nord now found themselves settling back into the same positions they had initially launched previous attacks from. For the few surviving NCOs amongst their number, it had become increasingly difficult to maintain order. Only the ever-present threat of capture by the pursuing Russian forces standing between them and a full-blown rout. When the attack finally came, it did so without warning. 1 minute, the weary infantrymen were rising from their slumber, in readiness for another day of slow retreat. The next, several of their number had already been scythed down, like ears of corn, by horse-riding Soviet cavalrymen. The Cossacks emerged from the morning mists like ghosts, moving with terrifying speed, seeming to make no sound whatsoever until they were virtually on top of their prey. As machine pistols rattled, and curved blades wildly swung from side to side, the last vestige of order amongst the SS troops disintegrated. Those who stood and fought died, whilst those who fled merely postponed their fate, ridden down and brutally dispatched from behind as they did so. Within minutes, the Russian riders had completed their labours, cheering wildly, slapping each other on the back in hearty congratulation. As the majority of their number clambered onto their steeds to head back to their camp, the remainder busied themselves with the task of looting the bodies of the slain German infantrymen. The young SS soldier, still days away from his 18th birthday, moaned weakly and reached out in supplication to the figure which was standing over him. With an indignant snort, the Cossack unsheathed his blade, before driving it down savagely into the throat of the German youth before him. Having wiped the blood from his weapon, he then ensured the dead teenager possessed nothing of value, before scanning the nearby bodies for other signs of movement. Several metres away, concealed behind a thickened patch of undergrowth, the Cossacks' actions were observed with horror by the only survivor of the slaughter. The SS unit's chaplain crouched down low to the ground, whimpering softly to himself as he watched the cavalryman stealing the possessions of his fallen comrades. He glanced down helplessly at the inscription on his belt buckle, which reassuringly informed him that God was with him, before breaking down and sobbing uncontrollably. This emotional outburst instantly attracting the attention of the Cossack, who had unsheathed his sword and began to stride purposefully towards the priest's hiding place. As death advanced upon him, the anguished holy man offered up a desperate prayer, pleading for the Almighty to intervene and to spare his life. And then somewhere, in the deepest recesses of his mind, a quiet and calm voice unexpectedly answered back. The terrified German stared down at the ground beneath his feet in confusion, time seeming to come to a standstill, while the voice who had replied to his plea continued. In a patient, almost reassuring tone, the speaker told the chaplain they were not the God that he believed in. But they were, however, able to intervene and prevent him from being killed now, and to keep him alive for many years to come. All he need do in order to prevent his passing was to give himself up completely to his Saviour, surrendering both his mind and his body to their entirety. Without hesitation, the terrified priest found himself agreeing with this command, his eyes widening in fear as the Cossack approached, sword raised high. The chaplain barely registered the searing pain as the metal of the blade plunged between his ribs, directly into his heart. With a soft grasp, he slumped forwards, before coming to rest on the dusty ground beneath. His murderer roaring with laughter, before loudly declaring the victory to the other Cossacks milling around nearby. This pronouncement received by his compatriots with an equal degree of amusement. The murder of one of Hitler's allegedly holy facilitators being a particular point of pride. Having petulously tossed both a crucifix and a Bible belonging to the dead man to one side, the Russian again wiped his blade clean, before moving off, in search of other plunder. For the next few minutes, the Cossacks sifted through the corpses of the slain, searching for anything of value. As was usually the way, there was little to be found. Sometimes one of the dead soldiers was still in possession of a wristwatch or a wedding band, but it appeared this unit had been long separated from any kind of baggage train. He was elated, therefore, to find a pair of gold fillings, hidden away deep in the mouth of a deceased German corporal, gunned down during a failed attempt to flee. With a satisfied grunt, the Cossack sat down astride the body, fishing into his tunic pocket in search of the pliers he carried with him for just such an occasion. Having produced the tool, he then busied himself with retrieving the fillings. So engrossed in this task, he became temporarily oblivious to the rest of his surroundings. A few feet behind where the cavalryman was vigorously engaged in his grisly work, the dead padre's right arm suddenly spasmed violently. For a moment, the movement ceased, before all of the fingers on the hand slowly extended, opening out to display one palm flat onto the floor. The left arm immediately followed suit, the chaplain's corpse slowly and deliberately elevating itself up into a crouched position, before then rising to stand upright. With his features blank and expressionless, the German looked around the clearing, taking note of the soldiers looting the corpses before him. After raising a hand to the bloody wound in his chest, he then began to shamble uncertainly towards the killer that had caused it. These first few movements were haphazard, uncoordinated, but with each subsequent step, the chaplain's pace increased in speed and confidence. With a flourish, the Cossack managed to pry free one of the precious fillings, holding it aloft to inspect his prize. It was the last thing he would ever do. A strong hand seized his head roughly from behind, twisting it savagely to one side with such force, it nearly came free from its shoulders. As bones cracked, skin tore and blood issued forth from sudden tears and ruptures now appearing, with the dying Russian managing to emit a gurgling cry of surprise. The other Cossacks instantly looked up from their looting, just in time to see the chaplain drop his victim's body to the ground, taking in the unnatural angle their comrade's head had fallen at, and the look of wide-eyed horror his dead face now displayed. Then as one, they unsheathed their swords and began to encircle the lone German. For his part, the chaplain again raised one hand to the bloodied hole in his chest, regarding the wound with apparent interest. As the approaching circle of Cossacks grew even tighter, he looked up again, now turning his attention to them. Ever so slowly, a wicked smile grew across the German's face, and his whole body seemed to tense in expectation. With cries of rage, the Cossacks charged, swords swinging wildly in the direction of their victim, completely unaware their blades would never connect. As if performing some form of ballet, the grinning German stepped backwards and sideways, easily avoiding the deadly blows. Again and again, the Russian riders slashed and stabbed out at him, only to stumble and overbalance as their foe effortlessly evaded these attacks. Without warning, the chaplain lunged forwards, taking hold of the nearest Cossack by the lapels, before sinking his teeth down hard and deep into the side of the man's throat. The Russian shrieked out in surprise, before his pitiful cry was instantly converted into a hissing gurgle, blood fountaining forth from the wound. In a heartbeat, the chaplain hurled the dying cavalryman directly into one of his fellows, smiling with satisfaction at the hollow snap as the second man's neck broke under the impact. The German barely seemed to register the sabre, slashing down deep into his right shoulder, instead spinning on his heel, using his left palm to drive the owner's nose directly up into the brainstem. Pulling the sword free, he allowed it to clatter harmlessly to the floor, before then taking hold of another terrified attacker. This unfortunate cavalryman watching on in terror as the chaplain deliberately extended its injured arm, slowly rotating it around its axis as if to regain feeling, and then driving it directly into his chest through the ribcage. Within less than 2 minutes, all of the Russians were dead, blood oozing out onto the dusty ground of the clearing from the horrific injuries that had been caused to them. The chaplain sat down to his knees, his palms rising to cover his eyes, as if the sheer horror of his actions had suddenly dawned on him, but then emitting a cackling shriek of victory. When he removed his hands, the German's eyes had changed completely, and were now filled with a deep crimson colouring. His breath ragged and heavy, he unbuckled his belt, tearing the Nazi insignia from his uniform tunic, before his eyes then fell upon the tracks from where the bulk of the enemy unit had ridden away, only minutes before. Prior to the German invasion, Artyom had led a simple and uncomplicated existence. As the son of the chief, he had on occasion been called upon to enforce his father's wishes, or to ensure that the agreed code of discipline for their village was being adhered to. But as a whole, he'd been unburdened by any major worries or decision-making in his short life, all of which had changed the day that an armoured company of SS soldiers had arrived at their settlement. The German commander had demanded the villagers hand over their food and water to support the advance of his troops. When Artyom's father instead attempted to bargain with him, the consequences had been predictable. The German grenadiers cutting down any villagers who tried to stop them, their Tiger tanks directed through the buildings, instantly killing anybody seeking shelter inside. The SS had then opened fire, indiscriminately upon the survivors, stopping just short of pursuing those who'd fled the slaughter. Artyom and others had watched on from the tree line as the invaders killed their animals and stole their foodstuffs, before pushing deeper further into their homeland. Sometime later, they had encountered the survivors of a similarly decimated Russian unit who had taken them under their wing. Not long after this, the young survivor unexpectedly found himself appointed leader of a small detachment of partisans. The majority of this unit being fellow survivors from his village, along with those from others that had also been razed to the ground. Amongst their number were the sisters, Anya and Alina, each of whom shouldered an identical sniper's rifle, these weapons having been eagerly handed to the twin siblings once they demonstrated their natural marksmanship skills to the soldiers issuing the equipment. Artyom was aware that both girls held affection for him, but neither had ever been bold enough to express it. Now though, in the midst of this chaos, he could see Alina growing the bolder of the two, holding his gaze slightly longer than her sister. Alongside them were Kolya, who had already been something of a misfit even before the war, and a bookish youth by the name of Rudy. Rudy's father had been the village priest, until he was visited by commissars, who had warned him that if he continued preaching, he would be removed from the community. Despite no longer being able to worship in public, the old man continued to raise Rudy as a strict Catholic, providing the boy with books and texts, which would have resulted in punishment had they been discovered by the authorities. Artyom turned to confirm the group had not lost anybody, and was reassured to see Fedor once again at the rear of the column, pushing the stragglers before him. The burly farmhand carried the unit's anti-tank mines in his pack, in addition to his own equipment, but never once complained about the burden. In truth, of all their number, he seemed to be the only one who was actively enjoying this new lease of life. Motioning for everyone to break for a rest, Artyom made his way to the edge of the trees, surveying the area that lay ahead with his binoculars. As he did so, he was conscious the twins had automatically fanned out either side of the group, also surveying the open ground ahead with their scopes. For the briefest of moments, he caught Alina's eye, returning the warm smile she offered him, before resuming his task. Approximately half a mile away, hidden amidst the thick lines of trees, something was burning, and from the thickness of the smoke, it did not appear to be wood. They had observed pockets of Germans fleeing ahead of them for the past few days now, sometimes cut down by bands of Cossacks, on other occasions escaping unmolested. Perhaps this was the aftermath of such an encounter. After a few minutes of contemplation, the young partisan leader made his decision. Calling over Fedor for the briefest of conferences, he then split the unit in two, and they slowly moved out to flank whatever it was they were approaching. Little could he have known at the time, in making this decision, he had condemned many of his followers to their deaths. The sickly sweet aroma of burning flesh was detectable long before they came within sight of the devastation which awaited them. Having signalled for his people to take up position in the tree line, Artyom surveyed the grim scene, whilst waiting for Fedor's team to appear on the other side of the encampment. In all, he counted approximately 20 dead Cossacks and their steeds, lying dotted around the patch of ground, all dispatched in a savage and inhumane manner. There were no obvious enemy corpses within sight, and he could not discern injuries consistent with heavy weaponry, indicating the cavalryman had likely been caught by surprise. Once Fedor had appeared and waved to him from a short distance away, Artyom gathered the rest of his group, and they emerged from the trees in a ragged line. As they advanced forward, the second team reciprocated this movement, the two lines of partisans slowly encircling all of the open ground. Whilst they did so, the twins held their positions in the opposing tree lines, silently scanning the periphery for any sign of movement. With each step deeper amongst the horror, the partisans began to succumb to nausea, the manner in which their countrymen had been slain making little sense. Some ravaged and feasted upon, others' bodies remaining unmolested, save for broken bones or bruising, indicating they'd been choked or throttled. 3 of the dead Cossacks had been seated upright together, with their backs to one another, their bodies clumsily pinned together using their own swords, each weapon having been buried into the corpse up to the hilt, so the blade protruded from the man behind them. Elsewhere, the head of one of the bodies had been replaced with the skull of his horse, whilst a pair of severed arms lay nearby, arranged into a roughly star-shaped configuration. For several minutes, the terrified partisans moved from body to body, confirming there were no survivors, before turning to face their leader for guidance. Artyom could hardly speak, still trying to comprehend the horror he'd witnessed, until he was torn from his thoughts by a high-pitched scream. As one, the group turned to see a terrifying figure stood holding Alina by her throat, in a vice-like grip. Artyom barely had time to register the darkly mottled skin of the intruder, or the unnatural protrusions of its forehead, before it then snapped the sniper's neck, dropping her lifeless body to the floor. There was a howl of rage behind him, and then bullets were tearing across the clearing into the face of the girl's murderer, as her twin sister fired upon him again and again. Events suddenly seemed to overtake Artyom, who was confused by a feeling as if he was standing outside his body, watching the attack play out in slow motion. As the intruder shrugged off the rounds impacting onto its skin from the barrel of Anya's rifle, it began to bound forwards towards the partisans on all fours, mouth wide open, in an animalistic snarl. Its skin was now almost as black as the tattered and torn SS uniform it wore, but its eyes were bright red, and almost seemed to be glowing. As it reached the nearest partisan, it drove its hands directly into the fighter's chest, easily penetrating the skin with long-clawed fingernails. The youth barely had time to cry out before the creature levered its powerful arms outwards, virtually tearing him in half. Gunfire erupted around the clearing, as the partisans began to pepper the monstrous attacker with small arms fire. Artyom could see bullets punching through the tattered uniform, tearing into the black skin beneath, but having no discernible effect. With blinding speed, the monstrosity had already dropped its victim, leaping high into the air, landing directly on top of another partisan. The poor Russian was instantly caught in the crossfire of his compatriots, dropping to the floor under a hail of gunfire. Undeterred, the creature sprinted to the next nearest victim, tearing an arm free from the man's torso, before clubbing him viciously around the head with it. As more and more of his men quickly fell under the relentless onslaught, Artyom snapped out of his paralysis, yelling for the remainder to retreat. But as the survivor militiamen began to fall back, continuing to fire as they did so, one instead ran forward. Screaming like a man possessed, Kolya took up the sabre of a fallen Cossack, repeatedly slashing away at the mysterious attacker. For its part, the creature stood with a slightly perplexed look on its features, as the sword was hacked and slashed violently back against its exposed torso, what remained of its tattered uniform falling away. In one movement, it had pulled the sword free from the Russian, kicking him to the ground, Kolya hissing at the entity standing over him, damning it with every breath in his body. But then the sword was brought down savagely across his throat, neatly removing the cursing partisan's head from the rest of his body. Artyom caught sight of Anya, rifle discarded, running at the monster with a knife raised high. He called out to Fedor, who nodded in acknowledgement, catching the girl in his arms and swinging her easily across his shoulders. In all, only 8 of the group had survived, running without pause for the next hour, until they happened upon another clearing filled with the bodies of dead Nazis and dead Cossacks. The remaining partisans quickly took up defensive positions amidst the piles of discarded German equipment and mutilated corpses. Nobody spoke for what seemed like an eternity, save for the uncontrolled sobbing from Anya as she lamented her dead sister. As they ran, she punched and kicked at Fedor, screaming at him for saving her life, before sinking silently down into his big arms in search of comfort and protection. Eventually it was Rudy that spoke, his words faint and whispered. He had seen pictures before that were similar to what had just attacked them in a book his father had owned. They depicted a demon from the old days, a trickster that grew more powerful with every human soul it claimed, a horned beast, black in colour with cloven hose, with bright red eyes, and its name was BES. A day ago, prior to what he'd just witnessed, Artyom would have berated the teen, telling him the old stories of ghosts and goblins existed only to keep children in line. But now, with the majority of his unit lying dead, the survivors crouched down between the dismembered bodies of Nazis and Cossacks, he could guess what had taken place. A terrified German had made a desperate and foolhardy deal with the devil prior to dying, and now he and his people were the ones left to suffer the consequences. One of the men broke down, asking how they were supposed to kill something that was immune to blades and bullets. It was Fedor who amusingly pointed out that most things could be killed with fire, and there were canisters containing fuel lying within easy reach. Artyom nodded in agreement, and outlined the loose threads of the plan he'd been forming in his mind. This creature would not stop, now it had encountered them. It would still be trailing them, likely soon to be upon them, and in order to kill it, they would need to spring a deadly and daring trap. At his bidding, the remaining fighters began to clear a space in the centre of their positions, digging deep holes in the ground, which they covered over with loose grass and foliage. Into the holes they poured out what remained of the German gasoline, being careful to camouflage each hole once they'd done so. Despite Fedor's insistence it should be he who should act as bait, Artyom refused to allow the request. It was his fault that their friends were dead, and the burden of avenging them rested upon his shoulders, and his alone. The young resistance leader ordered his fighters to pick up their weapons and move back to the trees, pausing to take the grieving Anya in his arms before they moved away. He softly reassured her they would live to see the coming dawn, and they would avenge her fallen sister, the girl smiling weakly and nodding in assent, before silently falling in with the retreating group of partisans. Artyom did not have long to wait. He had been seated alone in the clearing for several minutes, rifle resting upon his legs, when he detected a faint rustling in the trees to his front. He remained completely silent, watching on as the foliage shook and then parted, allowing a dark figure to emerge. In the dim and dying light that shone down from above, its red eyes glowed softly, and he thought he detected a slight hissing sound as its mouth opened and closed. Pressed deep into his right palm, concealed from the creature's sight, was the metal cigarette lighter that the Major had handed him the day he'd been appointed the group's leader. The officer had calmly and deliberately explained to the young villager that the item he had been given was not a status symbol to hold over his people. It was an effective means to provide them with warmth and light. To think of it as anything else would only lead to his eventual undoing, as it would to any other arrogant man. Watching the murderous entity advancing towards him across the moonlight clearing, Artyom allowed himself a smile as the Major's lecture went around his head again and again. It was now time for him to earn his position. The creature gave a seemingly confused grunt as its right leg unexpectedly sank down deep into one of the concealed holes laid in its path. It tugged hard at the trapped limb, which instead only sank down further into the fuel and mud-soaked interior of the pit. As its frustrated hisses grew louder, Artyom now rose to his feet and walked towards it, not knowing if it understood the words he spoke. How he would end its life for the suffering it had caused his friends. How he'd sworn to protect his people from all evil, whether it took the form of a man or a beast. With one last impassioned insult to the struggling creature, he ignited the lighter and then threw it into the pit. For the briefest of seconds, there was no visible effect, before the monster screamed out in pain as the fire consumed it entirely. Lifting his rifle, Artyom fired repeatedly into the struggling figure, aiming for its head, its heart, its genitals, anywhere he believed he would inflict the most damage or pain, and send it way back to the hell from where it had come from. But suddenly, amidst the roar of the flames, there was a hollow cracking sound. Without warning, the burning apparition suddenly parted from its trapped leg, falling forwards from the trap, leaving the stricken limb behind it. As it unsteadily levered itself up onto the one remaining leg, its skin hissed and crackled, fluid bubbling forth from the tears and cracks the fires had produced. Then it fixed him with a terrible leer, and gave a primal roar of anger. But the young partisan felt nothing anymore, least of all fear. With an equally impassioned bellow, he raised the empty rifle and ran at the creature, a wild swing connecting sharply with the monster's skull, a blow that should have felled it. Instead, the creature shrugged off the impact, a sharp claw whipping out to pierce the partisan's jacket as he passed by. A moment later, still balanced on its one remaining leg, the monster had hold of its prey in a deadly embrace, mouth wide open, ready to strike. From her concealed position on the far side of the clearing, Anya stared through her scope at the beast's ruby-red eye and pulled the rifle's trigger. The glowing orb immediately disintegrated as the bullet passed through it, causing the monster to howl in pain, dropping the young militiaman to the ground. Reloading the rifle, the sniper screamed at the rest of the partisans, ordering them forward to save the life of their leader. The survivors immediately breaking cover and running into the clearing, firing their weapons at the monstrous vision that stood before them. Lying dazed to one side of the monster, Artyom cried out, ordering the others to run to save themselves. But his warning came too late, the first of his people that charged the creature losing its head to a savage swipe from its claws. As he laboured back to his feet, he caught a brief glimpse of Rudy, pistol in one hand, holy book in the other. The priest's son was chanting something as he advanced on the monster, his words lost amidst the roar of the gunfire that surrounded him. But whatever the words, be they a prayer or curse, they did him little good. The entity sprang forwards, swatting the book from the youth's hands, driving one clawed hand deep down through his ribcage, directly into his heart. The scream that issued forth from Artyom's mouth seemed to stop time itself, a pitiful wail of helplessness and sorrow. The creature turned to regard him as he sank down to his knees, surrendering to the same fate as the other survivors of his village. With a triumphant hiss, the demon turned away from Rudy's remains, dropping them onto the floor before crabbing forwards upon its three remaining limbs, mouth open wide as it bore down on him, a nightmare of teeth and glowing eyes. But it never reached him. Out of nowhere, a huge shape barreled into the side of the oncoming horror, sending the pair rolling away. With growing alarm, Artyom realised what was about to happen, his eyes widening in horror. The monster's right hand lashed out, tearing a bloody gouge along Fedor's stomach, but the big farmhand ignored the blow, instead bringing an anti-tank mine down hard onto his stricken opponent's torso. Again and again Fedor hammered the explosive charge down against the prone figure beneath him, feeling bones breaking with every savage blow. Then with a flourish, he raised the device aloft one last time, igniting the fuse and smashing it down hard into the creature's face. There was a blinding flash of light, followed by a shockwave of heat that blew the few remaining partisans in the clearing clean off their feet. The force of the blast knocking Artyom down, his head connecting roughly with the cold, hard ground as he fell. For several minutes the world around him was nothing but darkness, until a distant voice started to call out towards him. As his eyes slowly reopened, he saw Anya above him, desperately cradling him in her arms. He coughed weakly, the act prompting a cry of joy from the girl, who then hugged him even harder. It took several minutes before she realised how badly he was injured, before she gently lowered him to the ground, asking what she could do to help. With a grim smile, Artyom asked her to help him to his feet, an act he could not unfortunately achieve on his own. Now upright, he scanned the clearing for any sign of Fedor or of the monster, but there was nothing. The place where they had been battling, little more than a scorched and discoloured patch of earth. As Anya began to echo the cries of victory from their few surviving comrades, Artyom felt the darkness once again rise to consume him, his violent cough bringing up blood as he crashed back to his knees, despite the girl's efforts to hold him. Arms gripping his stomach, he rolled onto his side, paralysed in pain. But there was another voice now, in his head, coming from the darkness that was rising up to surround him, a calm and soothing voice, almost seductive, offering promises of safety, of salvation. Shaking his head in despair, the young partisan ignored the words, instead allowing the pain to flood through his body, to claim him. As Anya's hold on his hand grew tighter, his own grip on hers relaxed, before dying away to nothing. She was safe from the monster now. This was all that mattered. He had done what needed to be done, and now it was time for whatever else lay ahead.